I want to talk about the Russia-Africa summit, all right? Because I talked about this with Pepe Escobar on the program earlier in late July when he came on. And it was an important event. It was a 2-day event. It happened a day after the coup, the 27th. It started July 27th, day after the coup in Niger. So all these developments in Niger have been happening around and after the Russia-Africa summit, which saw incredible developments. And Russia-Africa unity is just skyrocketing. It is just absolutely critical, and it has become a staple of African politics and African economic and political development. And so the Russia-Africa summit occurred. This was the second annual summit. And I just want to show you first an article by Morningstar, and then I will have the Duran folks talk about, from their channel, talk about the history of this, because Alexander Mercouris actually does an incredible job in going over some of the history, which dates back to the Soviet Union, of why African countries are so keen on building, rebuilding, and strengthening relations with Russia. It is incredibly important to note. But this was the biggest development, one of the big developments from the Russia-Africa summit, the agreement to write off $20 billion of African debt. And so it announced, so this was July 27th, it announced 20 billion or 15.5 billion the pounds of debt of African countries would be forgiven, and that Russia will provide hard-pressed countries with free grain. So the announcement was to cancel 3.5 billion in Angola's debt as a result of a purchase of weapons from the USSR, 5 billion from Ethiopia, 5.7 billion from Algeria, 4.5 billion from Libya. The Russian president also announced that his country would provide grain directly to 6 poor African countries following its withdrawal from the Black Sea exports, that whole Black Sea grain deal, and that he's ready to provide Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, CAR, Eritrea with 25 to 50,000 tons of free grain, free of charge. We will also provide free delivery. Russia makes a significant contribution to total global food security. Those who say it is not so are telling lies. I would like to note that last year, trade turnover between Russia and Africa reached $18 billion. So still a relatively small number, but big in terms of the scale of Russia's economy and these economies. So I'm confident that we can scale trade up massively in the foreseeable future. Despite the threat of U.S. sanctions and attempts to isolate Russia, some 49 African countries out of 54 are participating. They participated in the Russia-Africa summit. 17 heads of state participated, and we're going to get into all of this with the Duran folks, actually. So I just want to show that. That's the opening salvo to what it has become a deepening partnership between Russia and Africa. So I want to now play for you what the Duran folks had to say about this partnership historically. And Alexander Mercouris does a great job. There's not a lot of this that happens in the alternative media talking about the legacy of the Soviet Union and how African countries and Russia, in particular during the Soviet era and even afterward and now into today, has been one of friendship and partnership and really is an alternative. And so it really does defy the collective West's diktats, because the collective West doesn't want any of this. They didn't want it during the Soviet era, and they certainly don't want it now. But here's what Alexander Mercouris had to say about it.
The first thing to say about this is that there's been a big campaign about this summit meeting in the Western media. They're saying only 17 African leaders turned up, as opposed to 42 who came at the previous summit meeting in 2019. In fact, as I understand it, every single African country has sent representatives. I mean, I'm not aware of anyone that didn't. And yes, fewer presidents and heads of state have turned up, but this is taking place in the middle of a major geopolitical conflict that's taking place within Africa, which I think we're going to come to in a moment. So the impressive thing is not that, fewer turned up than last time, but as many as 17 defied pressure from the West and turned up in place. Now, what is happening and what the Russians are saying is during the time of the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, we made a very big push to establish very good and close relationships with people in Africa. We were at the forefront of support of the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial movements in Africa. We supported the movements against apartheid in South Africa, in Rhodesia. We helped Angola see off Western intervention, South African intervention in the 1970s and 1980s. We played an absolutely key role in helping Ethiopia to hold together in the 1970s and 1980s as well, after the fall of the emperor. We were very heavily involved in West Africa too. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. All of that stopped. We stopped taking any interest in Africa anymore. We neglected our old friendships. We now understand that that was a critical mistake. We didn't have the means to some extent to produce.
So this is a key point, right? Remember, the Soviet Union was absolutely critical to supporting anti-apartheid in South Africa, but not just that. All of the armed struggles on the African continent, the Soviet Union was involved in those independence movements. It did ally with them. And one of the reasons that Patrice Lumumba was actually killed in the Congo was not because this was 1960, and Alexander Mercouris will later get into a reference of him based on a university that was named after him in the Soviet Union and now renamed in Russia. But one of the reasons why he was killed by the CIA, by, of course, the forces of the West that assassinated him, by Belgium. The reason why they killed him is because he was beginning to indicate he would have friendly relations with the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union was always open to building stronger relationships. And then, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was not in the same position. But now things are changing. So let's continue.
Project ourselves back into Africa. Now we want to do so. And we want to come back into Africa in a big way. We also support African Union. We want the African Union, which is the organization that brings together all the African states, to be admitted as a full member of the G20. We are going to write off all your debt to us. I believe that's $20 billion. We're going to write all of that off. We're going to once again re-establish all the old links, all the old educational links that the Soviet Union used to provide. The Soviet Union had very, very extensive education graduate programs for Africans during the Cold War. We've renamed the university that was set up in the 60s to provide African students and students from other global South countries. We've given it back its old name, which it had in the 60s and 70s, which is the Patrice Lumumba Friendship University, renamed after an African leader. And we are going to give you also, if you're really in need of food, we have the means. We can replace all the food that Ukraine provided. We have.
So that's huge. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. This relationship goes beyond just the economics, even though the economics are, of course, important. Russia providing free grain to countries that are grain starved because of, really, they blame Russia for this, but really it was Ukraine's intransigence and the collective West, mind you, that Black Sea deal that they had. A lot of Ukraine's grain was actually just going to Europe in the collective West. It was not going to African countries. So Russia pulled out because it just wasn't fair to them, especially in the midst of a conflict. So Russia was like, oh, we'll step in because guess what? We're a major grain producer. But also this fraternal relationship being built between Africa and Russia. This renaming, it was called, I think, the People's Friendship University after the fall of the Soviet Union. This university located in Russia, which trained many people, many Black African American activists, scholars, theorists, and also people all over the global South went to the Patrice Lumumba University for education because they didn't have to pay for it, and it was specifically tailored towards supporting what the collective West would not support, which is the freedom of oppressed nationalities and minorities and ethnic groups, support their basic needs. Heck, Paul Robeson lived in the Soviet Union for a very long time. W.E.B. Du Bois, while he died in Ghana, he spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union. And of course, Patrice Lumumba, the naming of this university after Patrice Lumumba is very significant because, as I said, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated by Belgium and the U.S. intelligence services, assassinated, hung. He was killed brutally in 1960 or 1961, was it? I believe he came to power in 1960. I think he was killed in 61 because he represented what was a burgeoning independence movement that was going to take all of the Congo's resources and have them under the sovereign control of the people themselves through nationalization, etc. And then when he decided that perhaps it was time to diversify relations and begin talking with the Soviet Union, that was the final straw, and that's what got him killed. So naming this university after him was very significant politically and geopolitically. And so the fact that Putin is going back to this is really a huge step, I believe, in the right direction. And I believe this is all progressive, not how Americans and Westerners use progressive as some kind of partisan political position, but this is progressive in the sense that it moves the world forward back to a place that emphasizes fraternal relations, fairness, justice, and all of that peace, all of that good stuff that we hope for in geopolitics. So let's continue.
More than enough to do that, and we're going to provide it for free. And we want to increase our economic links with Africa. They're too low at the moment, but we want to increase those very considerably. So that's what the Russians are saying. And of course, what the West is saying in response is, under no circumstances, this is not something African leaders should even consider, getting too close to the Russians. If you get too close to the Russians in that way, you are going to be cut off from any potential World Bank or IMF funding. Now, this is playing out, as I said, in a major geostrategic struggle in Africa. Bear in mind, behind the Russians are the Chinese with their very deep pockets, who are also coming to Africa in a very, very big way. The key point to understand that in this conflict that we're seeing, all the African countries sent representatives to St. Petersburg, where the summit has been happening, and 17 leaders in Africa, often of important countries, Ethiopia, South Africa, Egypt, they defied the United States and they turned up.
How far do you think?
So I'm going to stop it there because I think that's enough of a point, right? You have the Russia-Africa summit occurred, right? It occurred July 27th, 28th. Lots of agreements, lots of new economic cooperation, the free grain to these poor African countries that have suffered because of the way the collective West has weaponized grain against Russia and then blamed Russia for not going along with it. Also, the writing off of debt. And mind you, as Alexander Mercouris said, it's not just Russia. Of course, you have $280 billion worth of trade and investment between China and Africa. You have infrastructure projects, right? China accounts for much of the electricity development on the African continent. China accounts for much of the railroad development, tens of thousands, right? We're talking about tens of thousands of kilometers of railways. You have tens of thousands of kilometers of roads being built. Essentially, China is Africa's biggest friend when it comes to economic development, bringing 5G technology and all sorts of other necessary amenities and infrastructure, from stadiums to we can go on and on. Factories, agricultural assistance, all of that. But also, just as Russia is forgiving the $20 billion of loans that date back some up to from the Soviet Union and onward to African countries, helping them get back on their feet in this really difficult economic time, so too has China done very similar things. And now China gets a hugely bad rap, right? It gets accused of debt trap diplomacy and all of this. But never do you hear, right, the fact that China has actually done a lot in this way to help accommodate African countries and their needs. So here Bloomberg wrote on August 23rd, 2022, that China was going to forgive 23 interest-free loans to 17 nations. And mind you, during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, China also did this as well in 2020, forgiving as well as renegotiating, which is just as important, renegotiating terms of loans, and pledged to rechannel to IMF trusts to Africa. So 23 interest-free loans to 17 African countries and redirect $10 billion of its International Monetary Fund reserves to nations on the continent. So this is 2022. And oftentimes China gets accused of debt trap diplomacy, the port in Sri Lanka, the airport in Uganda, and it said that China has essentially put all of its investment into Africa in order to colonize it and recolonize and become an imperial power, when all of it is absolute nonsense. In Sri Lanka, what ended up happening was that port had to be sold off to private investors because they just couldn't fund it because there's internal issues, there was government issues. So they sold it off to a private investor, and it became a joint venture with a Chinese investor. And the project, I don't know if the project even continued, but then you had accusations in, I think it was 2021, of Uganda having an airport that had to be seized by China and closed down even after it was built because Uganda couldn't pay its debt. That didn't even happen. That was just completely false. There wasn't even a story to distort there. So on and on and on. I mean, it's called debt trap diplomacy. And what is often not talked about is how it's the collective West, which usually it's private financiers, usually it's private lenders from the collective West, which make up the majority of debt for most global South countries, including African countries. And then, of course, there's the IMF and the World Bank, etc. But China usually makes a small portion of the debt, and China is actually more willing to negotiate fair terms. It's why you have on the African continent so much actually being built and so much investment actually turning into a real product, is because there isn't this worry about, oh, can we pay back? Can we pay back? Lest we forget that this kind of financial double dealing, this attempt to suppress and oppress African countries and in the global South with debt, is not just about the debt itself. It's really about how you can build up conditionalities and enforce conditionalities which help enrich the very corporations and the very oligopolies and monopolies that are overexploiting these said countries. So you mire them in debt, you enforce conditionalities through the IMF and the World Bank, and then these corporations come in and they get to extract more because your government has to pay off debt. You need to give privileges to these companies to an even further degree. And China just does not do that. Neither does Russia. And that's why you have Traore. That's why you have African countries in the West region, in the Sahel. That's why you have these countries not going along with the new Cold War. They're not going along with the Russia bashing and the China bashing. They don't support NATO's intervention in Ukraine. The Africa Summit, all of these countries that participated, you heard maybe East Africa's president, Isaias Afwerki. He said straight to Putin's face in a meeting with him, he said that Eritrea and much of Africa view Ukraine as NATO's war. Why is this? It is not a coincidence. It is not an accident. It's because it is NATO's war, first of all, but it's also because African countries like Eritrea, like Burkina Faso, from east to west, they see the writing on the wall. They understand the people of these countries, the movements backing people like Traore and Afwerki, they understand what is the problem. What exactly is the problem? What's the root of the problem in geopolitics, in economic development, and in political sovereignty? The root of the problem is the collective West. The root of the problem is the fact that Africa has never been able to develop the way that it always should have been allowed to develop because of foreign domination, mainly by the West. And China and Russia are simply partners that help them achieve sovereignty. Now, this is a take that will explode the heads of the anti-China, anti-Russia, Cold Warrior, neocon chorus. But their heads are going to have to explode and explode some more, because these developments are not to be arrested. They are not going to stop. Countries like Burkina Faso and Niger, they're all going to continue down a path of independence. Niger's coup, Chiani, I believe his name, the general, Traore, these leaders, they are ready to take their countries, at least from what they're saying and what they're doing, banning and severing ties with Western media, right? You have people in support of these leaders looting and robbing French embassies. You have a really huge seismic change happening on the continent that has to be understood as a rebellion against Western domination, unipolarity, and in favor of multipolarity and relations with Russia and China, because those relations support, they don't hinder, they don't attempt to thwart, but they support the sovereignty, the independence, the true sovereignty and independence that was never won during the Cold War and during the initial independence movements against colonialism. It was never fully won. Various countries were able to get to various places. Some succeeded more than others, and some today are more successful than others. But we have to see what's happening in West Africa and Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, etc., as part of a process of progress. And we have to defend these countries against ECOWAS, against NATO, against the United States, against France, against all countries in the West that seek to undo this. We have to defend them, and we have to stand with them, just as we have been standing, for example, with Russia against NATO, with China against the US's proxy war in Taiwan, and with countries all over the world that have suffered from sanctions, from proxy wars, from outright military interventions. We now need to include Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and the West African states in revolt onto that list. And for that, we should be very pleased, because the more countries we add to this list of that they need to be defended, the more we know we are going in the right direction toward multipolarity and true sovereignty, true independence, self-determination, and also a model of economic development that meets the needs of the people rather than the narrow interests of militarists, private military contractors, Wall Street, profiteers of all kinds. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.